I'm very pleased to
Hi.
welcome Dr. Carr for a new episode of my interview series. Dr. Carr is the head of the philosophy faculty at LaGuardia Community College and my current professor for landmarks in philosophy HUP 275. Her focus of philosophical interests are in ethics and philosophy for children. So good afternoon, Dr. Carr. Thanks for taking your time for talking with me. First question that I usually ask my former professors is, what brought you to philosophy?
Well, thank you so much, Sandro, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast series. I'm very honored to speak. And what brought me to philosophy? Love, like everyone else. I had a bias against philosophy, actually. When I was in college as a freshman, a friend of mine told me he was going to take a philosophy class, and I made fun of him. And this is a direct quote from circa 1998 Sherry. What are a bunch of dead white dudes going to tell you about how to live your life? So later, when I was a sophomore and I took an English class that was cross-listed with philosophy called Philosophy and Fairy Tales, and that was taught by Dr. Richard Pite, who's now the head of the Ethics and Leadership Institute at Viterbo. It changed my mind about philosophy. I realized that philosophy was the expression interrogation of our foundational belief and value systems. And the ideas, right? The ideas that orient how we know and interpret and act. So we got to talk about ideas themselves and the ways that ideas relate to one another and to the world. And that was the most exciting thing to me about the classes I was taking, right? So I was taking all kinds of other classes, but what I really wanted to talk about was ideas. And so that's what brought me to philosophy, love of ideas.
That's great. You said that you were laughing at philosophy or even maybe laughed at for philosophy. As you know, my current project is, entangled with the practicality of philosophy. And my claim is that philosophy has a stigma of being maybe laughed at in a way of it's not practical, it's not important, you should maybe, do something else with your career. So in your opinion, is philosophy per se a dying discipline because most students believe that they have a brighter perspective by pursuing a scientific or even technical academic career?
So yes, I did make fun of philosophy. I think there's actually a lot of humor in philosophy. But to your question, I think philosophy has always been hounded by the myth that it's somehow impractical. And we can talk about, right, the stories that we hear about Thales as examples of that. But I would argue that students at the beginning of their educational career, like especially community college students, and I'm philosophy for children, so high school students, middle school students, that they are the best positioned to get the most out of philosophy. When I came to philosophy, it's because I love exploring ideas, right? The foundational belief and value systems that orient how we know and interpret and act. But it was also because I saw how philosophy is the foundation for every other discipline. So, there's actually a really interesting experiment you can do for yourself, which I just did, before this interview. If you go to Wikipedia, you can look up any word. And if you click the first hyperlink, that's not just how you pronounce the word. If you click on the first hyperlink, within 6 clicks, you'll get either to a kind of like self-referential circle, or you'll get to a field of philosophy. Right? Philosophy is foundational to every discipline.
Can I ask you a question in between?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so as a foundation, I see that practicality, but as a totality in a field. And that's, in my paper, the claim that I'm trying to make is that even if you go all the way in pursuing philosophy as a major, maybe, a bachelor or even a master, that can be, a practical career to pursue, and not only to pursue practically, it goes beyond just, getting that foundation for opening up opportunities to become a lawyer, let's say. So, I mean, the question is like, is it just a good foundation, or is it also practical as, going all the way with philosophy?
I think I would push back against that question and say that something that's a good foundation is going to be good in itself, right? So I think that every field of study, right, as I was saying, every field of study has a philosophy that orients it, maybe even different competing ones, right? If you think about history or psychology, those are sort of the famous examples that come to mind. So when I started taking philosophy classes, it's because I knew they were a good foundation for anything I wanted to do later. But why did I stay in philosophy? Because I loved the exploration of ideas themselves, right?
All right, so your advice would be like, start studying philosophy. It will open doors for you. If
right.
you want to stay in that field, much for the better. And, it might be somehow interesting for your career as
right.
yeah.
So I think that, I don't think you need to be convinced at this stage that you should do a PhD in philosophy. All you have to be convinced of is that studying philosophy gives you such a good foundation that anything you decide to do later, you're going to do it better. And that's what I thought, right? That's what I knew,
and
just beginning the study of philosophy.
Sure, yeah, that's the history of philosophy too. I was talking to my former professor Guerrera about that. Philosophy is the groundstone of all sciences anyway, historically spoken. So thinking, being critical, and being maybe radical at some point has opened up doors for physics, has opened up doors for chemistry, has opened up doors for psychology. And so in a way, putting it in respect with the history of philosophy, and the importance of philosophy, pushing from a very beginning in these thought processes, may, wherever the career is going, help just because of that historical value of philosophy, right? No matter where one wants to go in their academic career.
Right. And so I think actually, another thing that I would emphasize is the idea of growth, right? Just because I went the direction of getting a PhD in philosophy, but even though that's what I did, and in many ways I've sort of chosen an academic field, the fact that I did this, actually, I'm not limited. I can change, right? I can decide to go into something else. I can decide to go into multiple different fields if I wanted to. And those are still viable options for me because philosophy is so multidimensional, right? Because philosophy is so foundational to other disciplines. So I started studying because I knew it would make me better at whatever it is I wanted to do later. Right. But there's always a later, right?
One question that comes in mind. So, yeah. One question comes in mind. All right, sorry. I know this online interviewing is very difficult actually, because it's a different dynamic. No, but the question that comes in my mind is, when I was in high school in Switzerland, we had philosophy. I was terrible at the worst grades was philosophy. It took me another 20 years just to realize how much I enjoy philosophy, how much I enjoy reading those thinkers from the past, and even, current thinkers. But it really took me all that time in order to rediscover philosophy. How can this field made attractive to young students that maybe at that point in their life don't think philosophy is important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's lovely that you came back to philosophy after so many years and found it, vibrant and interesting for you. I think that my worry about philosophy when I was an undergrad student was that it was just going to be a bunch of dead white guys trying to tell me how to live my life, and that was not interesting to me. And so I think that one thing that we can do as philosophers who are interested in trying to get the message about why philosophy is so fascinating out to the masses, right, out to the people, is by incorporating more contemporary philosophers. You know, people like Bell Hooks, for instance, my favorite philosopher. You know, I think her book All About Love should be required reading for everybody.
Can you explain what the book is about? Because that was one of my questions as well. What is your favorite philosopher? Because most, especially philosophy professor, mention like an old guy that died, as you said, like 2000 years ago. But can you just elaborate on this, your favorite philosopher, like what the...
And I do want, I don't want to say anything negative about someone like Plato, right? Plato's Republic is justifiably part of the foundational canon for becoming educated in our culture. It's a really, really excellent book. Plato's dialogues are beautiful in their own right, and they also form so much of the foundation of how we understand. And so I think understanding that and being critical about that is very important for becoming an educated person. But I think if what we're thinking about is like wooing people to philosophy, right, getting them to understand like what's at stake here, and why this is so interesting, then you have to find ways of hooking people based on their own interests, right?
So explain to me like, explain to me like what you like about that. I forgot the name because I don't know that I don't know her. Oh, here we go. All right, like perfect. I think we got that right in there. Can you just explain a little bit what the claim is inside that book?
So Bell Hooks in All About Love, and why I think this is a particularly good book to introduce people to philosophy for, is talking about what love is, right? And she starts with some kind of like myths about how we understand love. And she moves on from myths about love to try to build a theory of love that is about activity, right? It's about spiritual growth. It's about not just how we feel towards others. It's about how we treat others and treat ourselves.
So it's like an everyday practice, right? So an everyday practice, like I don't want to say like a way you have to live, but at least an insight in everyday life.
It is insight about everyday life, but it's founded in definitions and a value system and a way of orienting oneself to the world. Right. And so it is philosophy, and it's directly connected to something that's deeply practical for a lot of people, which is, how do I love?
That's great. And I will have Dr. Trusso on next on this channel. So
yeah, I'm sure she will have a lot of incredible things to say. So we will obviously,
link that book in that conversation. On the other hand, like just thinking about how philosophers from the past are getting quoted so heavily, how is it even possible that over like 2,000 or 3,000 years, like we still hooking on to, hasn't, with all these people living on this planet, how is it possible that we can't be taught in school other thinkers rather than people that just wrote and spoke 3,000 years ago? How is that possible?
So, I mean, I think we can, and I think we should be looking at more contemporary authors. And I think that there is a place for thinking about the classics that have created the foundations of how we understand the world, right? So Platonism, for instance, right? Platonism in many, for how as people understand it, has sort of laid the foundation for a lot of how Christianity's philosophy was developed, right, over the years, from connecting with this kind of Platonic distinction between the body and the forms, right?
Right.
And so, like, understanding how that happened can help us when we are attempting to try to think otherwise, right? When we're like, okay, so this understanding of the world has a history. This understanding of the world has a foundation, and look, I can point to it and see why is it that he thinks that it's this way, and then I can see, okay, well, is it this way? Like, is this the way we really should understand the world, or is there another way that maybe is more representative of of how the world has changed, or what we think is real, or more evidence that we've gotten over time.
Right. But
etc.
how is it not part of like just history, right? Like if you have I don't know, philosophy 101, like it's all about I mean, it should be called history of philosophy sometimes, right? And not like what current thinkers have to say. So isn't that supposed to be part of
Yeah.
like a history class? Like
I
that's what
would
baffles me sometimes.
Yeah, I would argue that the history of philosophy needs to be taught alongside contemporary philosophers. So instead of us thinking, okay, here's ancient philosophy, and we need to understand that, and then we'll eventually get to contemporary philosophy, I think that we have to explore the problems of ancient philosophy in the context of understanding contemporary problems, right? Because that's how they continue to still have relevance, and that's how they continue to actually be sort of interesting to me, at least.
Right.
So I do think they're interesting to many people in themselves. But I think that those people would probably call themselves historians of ideas or classicists, people who are interested in those ideas for themselves and not really how they have
I'm just like wondering
problems.
Why contemporary thinkers, philosophers are like, they're in the universities, being professors, maybe, think about David Chalmers, for example, or, there's a ton of them. They're not really taught on an entry level. It's just about history, but not really going to, where we at today, maybe. And maybe sometimes professors are a little bit scared of maybe quoting contemporary philosophers because they're still alive.
I don't think that's the case.
No?
No, I mean, I think that there are, obviously this is so different for each and every professor, right? Like, how do you teach an introductory class? Some people do think that an introductory class really should be a class about history. It should be a foundation for you to say, like, okay, well, I understand these names. So then when they get brought up later by your Nietzsche or by your Chalmers, right, you're going to understand that.
Okay.
And so I do think there are people who think that, but there's plenty of people who teach introduction as problems in philosophy, and the problems in philosophy are not ones that have gone away. The
True,
problems in philosophy are renewed, right, with every generation of philosophers.
And that's the beauty about it.
Thing.
Yeah, that's the beauty about like reading classics. They're usually the first ones that brought up that problem,
or at least the first ones that we still have.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because not everything is recorded, especially, women in philosophy is not recorded very prominently, not as prominently as male philosophers. Maybe, what's her name? Catherine de Bourgeois. she is probably the first female, the existentialist.
Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So but before that, we don't have a lot of female representatives in philosophy. How do you think that happened?
Do I have some books for you, Sandro?
Yeah.
There's actually plenty of women who did philosophy prior to Simone de Beauvoir. They just tend not to be included in the canon that you're given as sort of introductory philosophy students.
And also, it's not like, like if you ask anybody in the street, like, do you know a philosopher? They will most likely name a male philosopher. How do you think that is possible?
I think it's because of the way that philosophy is taught, right? It's the way that philosophy is taught according to a certain, right, Western, very white, very male canon that has been reproduced, right, through the years. And I don't think that there's been a lot of emphasis placed in universities, particularly prestigious universities, on changing the undergraduate curriculum to be more representative. I do think that there's plenty of places and professors who are doing this work. And
I'm sure as well, yeah. I'm just saying, in terms of like history, like you take a history class, women are always playing a very important role inside, history.
That's so wonderful that you've gotten that in your history classes.
but
because
it's,
not everybody gets that.
yeah, like, you know,
Our
Napoleon
history
has
professors will
been,
be so happy to hear that.
yeah, no, because Napoleon is just like celebrating his 200-year death, celebrating. And that, I mean, his wife has been, or like even his not wife has been majorly influencing who that person was, which makes then the woman more important too. But I mean, I think, you know, we covered that pretty much. I want to go to one of your passions in philosophy right now, which is bioethics. Bioethics, of course, as we know, is a field that is very diverse, and it includes many different fields of you know, ethical questions mainly, environmental, animal, medical, other fields of life ethics. I think you are teaching medical ethics, if I'm right. And you say that the focus in my medical ethics classes is on ethical design. Can you explain quickly what ethical design means?
Yes. So when I say ethical design, what I'm talking about is policy and infrastructure, right? So institutions have policies and they have infrastructure. And so how can we design those in a way that focuses on creating justice, right? Respecting autonomy, building trust, right? Healthcare organizations in particular, right? Because it's a medical ethics class, it's healthcare organizations that I'm interested in.
Like the WHO, for example?
So I don't really talk much about the WHO. I'm mostly, in this class, at least, we are mostly focused on creating policy for an American hospital, right? Because that's the interface that most of the students who come into the class, that's the interface that they most understand, and that they're able to sort of like build policy and infrastructure for.
Right, okay. That's interesting because, as you know, that's a field I'm very interested in, also through my heritage in my family, you know, from biochemists to doctors and all of that. I'm probably the black sheep that just has to talk about it instead of executing it, but still I'm doing it. But it's very interesting because I know my great-grandfather, for example, he was, you know, he was running a hospital, et cetera, before he gave any substance to one of his patients. He tried it on himself, believe it or not, but like he had to see like, what am I injecting? What am I giving my patients? So now we're in a pandemic, which is also an okay, now I'm messing up. And how can I lose that word right now? Epidemic, yeah, like it's a process of epidemic becomes a pandemic. So the last problem we were talking about in terms of spread disease, if you want to talk about drug addiction being a disease, was you know, the disease of prescription drugs. Nobody talks about that anymore right now. What do you think is more severe, the drug pandemic that we had? I think it's called. I mean, I don't want to say heroin but it comes from heroin. Opiate epidemic. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So, do you think this epidemic is more severe, because that's a really specific medical ethics problem? Is that more severe than a pandemic that can, you know, then through technological processes hopefully be eliminated?
I mean, I think that both can be eliminated, and I don't think that I wouldn't want to compare them to one another, really. I think they're both very important, and that the ways in which we would try to address them are different. The opioid epidemic is one that has been largely fueled by the drug industry, and has been devastating for so many people. But I do think that underlying the opioid epidemic is the undermining of the middle class. the way in which wages have stagnated, the way in which union jobs have been lost, the way in which college has become more and more unaffordable for everyday people. And that has led to what some people have called a dramatic rise in deaths of despair. And so that includes opioids, right? But it also includes alcoholism and suicide. And it's not very often talked about, but the people who are the greatest number of victims of gun violence are oneself, right? White men between 35 and 60 are at a significantly increased rate of suicide. And I think that in many ways that's that's a symptom of a larger problem in our culture with how we've treated the middle class, right? With the protections that have
and that is sourced in the opioid epidemic in a way. So
yeah.
it's
So
like it's like
right.
more. All right. So like so it's
so these
more
are
like
symptoms.
a slow creeping up process, whereas what we're going through right now is like a shock process. And I think maybe slow processes are taking longer to, deal with, whereas shock process or maybe sometimes faster to eliminate. I don't know, but
yeah, maybe.
you're
Maybe
right that
there's
it shouldn't be compared, but like it's just funny like that nobody like hears epidemics anymore. Everybody talks about pandemics.
I think that one thing that we have to also acknowledge about the opioid epidemic is that it's often perceived to be a mental health epidemic rather than, say, the problem of access, right? Rather than putting the responsibility in drug companies' hands, which I think arguably it should be, as one of the underlying symptoms, right? There's also the undermining of social structure. But mental health phenomena, right, have often been overlooked because in, again, American culture, the value is placed more on individuals being able to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Figure it out, grit, resilience, like we can do it. And we can just keep working until we literally die.
Right, yeah. Would you call it a disease though, like that mental health that leads into drug addiction?
I mean, just that question is a symptom of the way in which mental health has been deprioritized in relationship to physical health, right? As if the mental and the physical are somehow like deeply divided in our bodies, and that we can bring that all the way back to Plato. And that divided line, right? Why is it that we see this dramatic distinction between the mind and the body? Well,
but don't you think then it should have another word than disease? Because I never heard anybody yell at somebody with cancer, oh man, what the fuck, you got cancer? But you hear some people yelling at others that are alcoholics and say like, yo, just stop drinking alcohol, right? So there's like some type of a displacement there.
Yeah, no, I agree that there's a sense that somehow mental issues are your own responsibility, right? Your fault in some way. Whereas
if it is
people
a dualistic
tend
view,
to think
then it should maybe a
physical illnesses as somehow your fault. I do think that there is, like, you give the example of cancer. My sister, when she was suffering from cancer a few years ago, she was surprised at how many people, asked her about, what she did to somehow deserve the cancer.
Oh, really?
In various ways, right? Various ways of asking, like, oh, were you a smoker? Because hers was an oral cancer.
Right, yeah.
Oh, were you a smoker? Oh, is this a family, condition? Is this, she was like, people asked me if I ever did meth. And she was like, have you ever met me? Like, of course not.
Well, I don't know your
But she didn't,
sister's friends, but that sounds terrible. Yeah, but it goes exactly.
right. So
So actually, that's a good answer for my question. Like, I really, because it seems to be maybe imbalance there. Like, there is
right.
arguments to say, well, yeah, both of it can be yelled at depending on the perception of whoever is
People,
getting this
people
information.
want to assign responsibility.
Mm.
They want to assign responsibility to individuals rather than accept that maybe responsibility is more diffuse than that. And it's on the one hand, like assigning responsibility is kind of empowering, right? Because you can say, okay, well, even though my situation is like this, if I do A, B, C, and D, then I can like rise above this situation, right? Through my own power of will. And that's wonderful.
And you believe that's
But
true?
I
Do you
think
believe?
I think that can be an empowering message to say to yourself. But it's also the case that really ignores much of the, social construction of our possibilities. I have two very small children, and there was no willing myself into being able to do a full-time job and also watch both of them while in the first few months of the pandemic.
That actually brings me to my second last question already. What is your best argument against like a hard determinist? Or let's say, what's your best argument for, well, here we are with free will? Because that is one of the big philosophical questions that really have not been solved, in my opinion. So I would love to hear your opinion on that, because that goes kind of hand in hand, because people say like, well, it just happened. It just,
Here's my foolproof method for responding to either hard determinists or hard free willists. I don't know, what are they called? Volunteers. Why can't it be both?
So you're so-called, I don't think they call moderate determinists, but there is a...
Why can't it be both? I mean, it does seem like the evidence seems to be pointing to both. So why can't it be both?
You want to ask me that? Because that would have been the last question. It's like, do you have a question for me? Seriously, that was my last question.
I don't know. Do I have a question for you?
Well, you just asked me a question because you asked, why can it not be both?
Yeah, why can it not be both? Sure, why can it not be both?
Sure. Should we just like leave that as a question for me, and I'm trying to answer it, because, and that would be my answer to that is, well, hard determinism means like, you push a domino stone and everything else from there goes automatically. So do you think there can be one domino stone in between that will have the freedom of choice of saying like, well, no, I'm not falling? That's why it can't be both. It can be either one or the other. That would be my answer to that question.
No, because I think it's reductive to suggest that the entire world is domino stones.
But that's hard determinism. That's just a theory.
Right, and it's reductive.
So it can't be both. Should we leave it of agreeing with disagreeing maybe at this point?
Oh, no. What
should
I'm
we
suggesting,
go ahead with that?
No. What I'm suggesting is that we are both determined and free, and that the hard positions are a false dichotomy.
Okay, fine. That is all right. That I totally accept. But it can't be hard and soft at the same time, right? Like it can't be hard deterministic and perfectly idealistic free will theories at the same time. It can be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but then it's not this and it's not that. It's something.
Right.
All right, cool. I guess we're pretty much half an hour at this point, so
yeah. And I got to go get those kids.
Yeah, go feed those kids.
No, not feed them. I have to go get them.
Oh, you go get them.
If
okay.
they were here, we wouldn't be able to have an interview.